Welcome everybody to our public webinar on the community experiences of the 2022 floods across New South Wales and Queensland. My name is Kat Haynes and I am the Natural Hazards Research Australia Node Manager for New South Wales, ACT and South Australia. And I'd like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded today. I'd like to acknowledge that we are all meeting across a range of different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. I'm on Darawal country on the beautiful south coast of New South Wales, just south of Wollongong. First Nations people have long looked after and cared for country as kin, and they continue to do so today. I'm a guest here on Darawal country, as I am wherever I walk in Australia, and sovereignty has never been ceded. We at NHRA can play a fundamental role in dismantling the ongoing processes of colonisation and supporting Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people on this journey. After all, we all share the same fundamental goal, that of resilient and sustainable landscapes and communities and everything in between. So this post-flood research was funded and managed by NHRA under our Learning from Disasters stream of work. The research was conducted by a large team of social researchers from Macquarie University in New South Wales, Queensland University of Technology, and the University of Southern Queensland. I want to acknowledge the considerable support provided by our partner agencies QFES and New South Wales SES throughout the whole process, from project inception, execution, and now into the translation and implementation of the research. The aim of the research is to provide advice and guidance to agencies involved in supporting community preparedness, response and recovery, but also to explore the underlying social drivers of these disasters and the barriers, challenges and opportunities in long-term risk reduction and adaptation so that we can avoid disasters on this scale as we move forward. The methodology was originally developed for Black Saturday research back in 2009 that was supported by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC. It involves a mix of in-depth interviews followed by a questionnaire that is informed by those interviews. The key aspects of this research are the gentle interview techniques that allow the respondents to provide the information that they think is important. So we ask participants to tell us their story in their own words. This ensures that all themes of importance to the community are raised, rather than going in with a predetermined idea of what we think the issues are, which then limits what people might say. So I would now like to introduce Mel, who is an honorary associate professor at Macquarie University. Mel would describe herself as an occupational psychologist, but is probably much more of a human geographer these days. I'll now hand over to Mel, and then we will have, at the end, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So if you are thinking of questions as you're listening to Mel, please type them into the QR box on the bottom of the screen. So I will now hand over to Mel. Thank you.
So thank you everybody for joining us today live, and for those watching the recording subsequently. As Kat's introduced the team to you, or the universities, I will just like to acknowledge my colleagues and all the work that they've done to help with this project, and also the NHRA team who've helped a lot along the way as well in guiding us. I also want to thank, before I start, the participants who took part in the study, and in particular I'd like to mention that I've got a number of photographs I'm using in this presentation that are ones that were provided to us by the participants, and I'd like to thank them for allowing us to do that. Just as floods leave physical scars on the landscape around us, they also leave scars on us individually. And so I'm very keen now to just ask people who are watching live, or those who are watching the recording, to have some self-care. And if you become concerned or distressed by the content of the presentation, to please feel free to stop watching, and also to reach out. So there are some support lines there, and some great support that's available from the Department of Health and Aged Care, but also from Australian Red Cross and Phoenix Australia. Some great supports there, both for people directly impacted and for those working with people and also living in communities where there have been multiple impacts. So quickly, just a quick overview of where I'm planning to go today. So I've divided the presentation up into a number of sections. So I'm going to give you a short overview of the study and what we did. I'm then going to talk about some of the cross-cutting themes. These are some of the broad common themes that came out during the interviews, in particular that really have impacts across a lot of the other things that people have said to us, the things that make these particular floods perhaps slightly different to what it perhaps had come before. I'm then going to go through a series of findings from the study and just talk about sort of, I guess I've structured that in a kind of before the flood, during the flood, after, and then reflections, so what people were thinking looking back, but also what they're thinking about doing in the future. And then hopefully, if time allows, I'll talk a bit more about some of the concluding points and some of the work that we're doing to disseminate and hopefully get this fantastic input that we've had from people used by stakeholders and communities. So the study overview. So we talk about this being a mixed methods approach, and really what that means is we've just used a couple of different approaches in the study. So in this particular instance, we've used interviews where we've talked to people one-to-one about their experiences, as Kat has outlined, and we've also got an online survey that we've used. So the interviews, as you know, are quite an open conversation where the participant leads that conversation, tells us about their experience, tells us about things that are salient to them, things that have happened to them. We don't impose any kind of restrictions on what they talk to us about. And that gives us a lot of in-depth information, quotes, rich information that we can use and analyze into themes, common things that people have said, but also things that have been said that are different. So it allows us sort of to do that sort of subjective analysis of some of the issues that people have faced. Typically, interviews tend to be, or the interviews in this case tend to be sort of relatively negative, because they're looking, or we're talking often about challenges and things and problems that have been encountered. So although I will talk a bit about those problems, I will talk mostly about problems and challenges, I also want to make it clear that there was a lot of strength, there was a lot of positive things in there as well. And I don't want that to be lost as we go through. The quantitative survey, this provides us with information that is more representative across people who've been impacted by floods, and it gives us a better balance of information, but it also is slightly more superficial, but we can use that information then to do analysis, statistical analysis and other sorts of evaluation of the research. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides about the interviews and the survey. And so there's a few pieces of information in here that I'm really keen to talk about. First, there is on the left-hand side, you can see the map. That's a postcode map, and it just shows you where a lot of our interview participants were based. So although you can't see it very clearly because of the small postcodes in the centres of some of the large cities, about 50% of our Queensland interviews took place in and around Brisbane area, and the Queensland team led those interviews. So Kim, who's here today from Queensland University of Technology, she and her team talked to a lot of people around the Brisbane area, those suburbs, and up in Maryborough. And then Barbara Ryan and the team at University of Southern Queensland interviewed people out to the west in Warwick, Grantham, Dalby, Southern Downs area, and in Gympie. And in the New South Wales team, we did most of our field work in the Northern Rivers area. We were asked to sort of focus a bit more in that area. So 70% of our interviews are from that area. And then we've also got people that we spoke to in Hawkesbury, Hunter, Central Coast, and around the south of Sydney as well. In terms of how we got our interviewees, we did a recruitment survey, so people were able to put their hands up and say, I'd like to take part in the study. We did quite a lot of media and other approaches on social media to get awareness of the study out. And then we also got a lot of our interviews through word of mouth as well. And those interviews were on Zoom and telephone, but also in person. So the fieldwork was in person. And we undertook 192 interviews in total, 92 in Queensland and 100 in New South Wales. And the important thing here as well is that we did those interviews between mid-August to the end of October. So for people who were impacted by flooding in late February, March, that was around 6 to 8 months after that flood. And for those people in other areas that were flooded subsequently, and I'm thinking particularly in the Hawkesbury area and around those areas in July, they had their major flood in that point, which was one of a series of floods they'd had. So for some of those people, it was 1 to 3 months afterwards. And the reason I'm keen to make that comment is because, as you know, this was participant-led, so we were aware of what issues were salient to people at the time, but we also did lead them through an interview guide in terms of we were checking off that they were talking about what had happened beforehand, what had happened during the event, and some of those things you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there. And we code this in terms of themes. So we look for common points that are being made in the interviews and use that to sort of distill into the sort of reporting that we do. And then finally, the other important point here is, as you'll appreciate, there's quite a lot of different flood experiences here. So some people had the really dramatic, fast onset flooding that was life-threatening. Others had slower floods. Some people were not directly impacted in terms of their homes being, having water in them, but they were isolated, cut off, had landslips and other things. So quite a range of different experiences here from our interviewees, but similarly from our survey participants as well. And just briefly, the survey participants came from very similar areas because we're looking at the same series of floods that occurred in January to July last year. We've got 430 responses to that survey, which may not sound a lot in some ways, but actually it's a really involved survey. So as you can see on the right-hand side, there's a whole heap of different questions we asked, the sorts of things that were covered in interviews as well. And this was informed by the interviews and by prior work that had been undertaken post-bushfire and post-flood, using similar sorts of questions, so we can have some comparison there as well. And the surveys were run late November through to February, and most of those responses came in after Christmas, so January, February time, which for most people was around 10 months after the event. And we've done some sort of simple statistical analysis on that. So, the advantage of the survey is we're able to look across those different areas. We can look within the sample and look at how preparedness impacted people's decision-making and how that impacted their recovery or their ratings of recovery, and how things like differences in gender, differences in prior flood experience, what sort of impacts they had on people's decision-making. As you'd be aware, we've released a number of reports. So we have summary reports, a main report and a technical report. And one of the important aspects here for us in terms of the research and for Natural Hazards Research Australia is that the research that they help to fund and support is used by people. So in writing up the reports and looking at the data, we were very keen to focus on things of interest to policymakers and those in practice. So alongside obviously looking at things that were salient to participants, things that our research team felt were important to draw out, we were also aware of the requirement or the need to think about how this information could be used, so that hopefully the time we've been given by our participants can be put to good purpose. So I'm now going to cut through to some of these cross-cutting themes. So these were some of the common themes I said that I think made these particular floods particularly challenging for people. So I've identified 5 different themes that I'm going to just quickly mention. And the first one is the severity of the event. And clearly we know that the events in February, March and July were extreme. They were very serious. And the impact of that is, as you can see on the right-hand side here, is that people were impacted in different ways. So I want to draw attention to that graph there. So this is the only one where I've actually got New South Wales and Queensland separated out. The rest of the time I'll just have the whole sample. But here you can see New South Wales in blue, Queensland in orange, and the whole sample in grey. And we asked people whether they'd experienced floods at their same property or this sort of similar location previously. So the important thing I wanted to draw out here was that 37% of our survey respondents had not been flooded previously. So this was their first experience of flooding. However, the remainder had been flooded at least once. And as you can see in the graph here, 18% of our total survey sample had been flooded in the prior year. So they were still managing, the outcomes of those floods. And others had been flooded in, those other periods of time. And some people had been flooded multiple times across those periods as well. So what we've got here in the survey sample, and indeed in many of the interviews, were people that had been impacted by flooding previously. They were experienced, they were savvy, they were aware of the hazard, not complacent, not lacking any awareness or understanding of the impacts that they may be facing. So really important to bear that in mind. But alongside that, we've also got this, just over a third of our sample here who hadn't been flooded previously, and many of our interviewees have not been flooded previously. And some of those people have been in their homes for 10, 20, even 30 years in places. So for that group of people, flooding had not even been on their radar. And as you can see in the quote at the bottom of the screen here, this was a fairly sort of typical kind of comment that was made about either by individuals or by people that they knew. You know, in this case, somebody talking about their neighbour who'd moved in 6 to 8 months before the flood. They'd looked at when they'd gone to insure their home, they'd looked at flood risk and they'd been told it'll never flood here. So they hadn't taken out flood insurance. So we've got people in here who, like that person, you know, wouldn't have been flood insured. We've also got people who've been flooded multiple times who similarly didn't have insurance, couldn't afford premiums, etc. So quite a range of different experiences there for those people with different levels of insurance too. The second and third themes here I'll take together. So this is about the scale of the events and the timelines that have come out as a consequence of that. So at the time, the scale of the event, the magnitude of the event was extreme. It had happened across a wide area. So a lot of people were impacted at the same time. And of course, you know, during the event, that had implications for the capacity of responders to actually help and to warn people, but also longer term, it's had impacts in terms of the timelines that have been drawn out beyond, I think, what people had mostly expected would be the case. And of course, since the floods that we were looking at, there have been, of course, extreme floods in other states, inland in New South Wales as well, and across to the west of Australia. So a whole lot of people have been impacted by flooding around the same sort of time. And of course, that's led to quite a lot of scarcity of various things. So if you look down on the right-hand side there, you can see the graph here. I'm just using this as a way to exemplify some of that. So we asked in this question, what sort of challenges people have been having about getting back into their homes. And so if you start to look down that list of different responses there, and people make multiple responses here, you can see there are issues there about not being able to get hold of trades, not being able to get building supplies, waiting for damage assessments. And this is 10 months post-flood for some people, slightly less for some people. You know, waiting on insurance decisions, waiting on decisions about buybacks. So a lot of waiting, partly because of the capacity, you know, to get through these things, but also those shortages and scarcities of trades, of supplies, etc. And I think if you look at the bottom of that graph, you can see, you know, more than half of the sample here was saying that everything was just taking longer. And as you can see on the last part there, you know, over a third felt that they weren't actually dealing with this particularly well either. And that really leads, I think, into that sort of uncertainty, that waiting around, and the mental health impacts that that can have as well on our those people who've been impacted. The last two here and the cross-cutting themes is around sort of compounding concurrent disasters and climate change. And as you can see in the quote here on the right, sort of COVID is one thing that clearly was impacting on a whole lot of ways on communities beforehand, in terms of the amount of connectedness and ability that communities had to sort of meet together, but also in terms of the impact it had on things like supply chains and on expectations. So the person here on the right-hand side is making the comment that, as I say, between COVID and this, I don't think you can separate the two, because we were so far behind the 8 ball when this happened to us. You know, we literally went through from, yeah, we're going to get freedom from COVID, and then we actually stepped even further back with the flooding. And so this person is talking about, you know, some of the impacts that has in terms of raising more uncertainty, you know, the looking forward to a future that then is sort of dashed again by this additional adversity. And of course, we've got people in our sample, people we've interviewed who were impacted multiple times by flooding and by bushfires, etc. So there's not this opportunity, as there may have been in the past, to sort of recover from one thing before another thing hits. We're dealing a lot more with compounding, concurrent, subsequent disasters and adversities that are impacting on people. And then finally, vulnerability context. And this is referring to some of the issues around sort of differences between communities. So, you know, different communities will be having different starting points. So some communities function very well, they're very well connected, they're perhaps more affluent, they've got a mix of different demographics. Others have got different challenges in terms of some of the social vulnerabilities, in terms of, you know, older populations, poorer housing quality, and physical locations and other things that disasters just tend to exacerbate. So you add a disaster to some of the difficulties that communities might have, or some of the vulnerabilities they have in terms of their locations, and those things just tend to get worse with disaster on top. So now I'm going to cut through to the first of 4 sections where I'm going to talk about some of the findings from the research, and I'll talk a bit about some of the qualitative data for the first few of those themes, and then some quantitative data on the preparedness. Going back to before the floods, when we spoke to people about what they had done before the flooding occurred, the sorts of things that were coming up were around issues to do with flood data and availability of flood data. So this includes everything from what they felt the accuracy of that information was, the transparency and availability of that information. And so in this particular instance, you can see this quote here is from someone whose parents had bought the home that they lived in, and they were based over in Western Australia. And they said that when they bought the place, they asked the real estate if it flooded, and they said no. And then when this person moved in, the neighbours would come past walking dogs and say, this place floods, right? And they were saying, no, we were told it doesn't. And they said, no, it does. It comes right up to the house, etc. So this is what we were finding in this context, that people were saying that, these sorts of things were issues for new people arriving who weren't aware they were going to be they could be flooded, for tenants who were signing leases not being aware. So again, it was coming back to some of this transparency, the availability of information. There was lots of discussion about some of the visual signs and signage could be around in terms of, the flood heights of previous floods and that sort of information, and wanting more transparency, more up-to-date sort of flood planning, flood maps available to help people make plans and to increase that sort of awareness. And of course, the other issue in this area is in terms of, in terms of the comprehension and understanding of some of the terminology, but also the translation of that information to a meaningful information for individuals. So other comments were around, knowing about sort of gauge heights, but not know what that meant personally for people. So that sort of not just provision of information, but actually that translation and comprehension of information as well. People also spoke to us a little bit about disaster dashboards. So if you're based in New South Wales, you might not be aware that in Queensland, there are slightly different disaster arrangements, and local councils across Queensland have disaster dashboards where they bring together a lot of different information into one place where people can go to get information, in this case about flooding. And we found that when people were talking about this, there was a lot of appreciation for some of that information. So, the live data, the cameras on bridges, on roads, on rivers, so people could see in real time or near real time there was, what was going on. That was really appreciated. But what we found is that often, people were commenting that information wasn't being uploaded frequently enough, or cameras weren't maintained, and so that information wasn't available. Interestingly, my Queensland colleagues said that a lot of people didn't even mention dashboards or weren't aware of them. So there's some information, some understanding there around, whether people actually knew that's where they could go for that information. And there were also issues around sort of usability of that information. So clearly some people were having problems in terms of actually using that information and feeling that it could be much better organised and arranged. And that wasn't limited only to Queensland. So some councils in New South Wales are also adopting this dashboard approach. But again, what we found is that there were the same sorts of issues around sort of that maintenance and also about the usability of some of those systems. But we also found that people were very appreciative of some of that information that's coming out from local councils as well. And the person here talking on the right is talking about how good their council was about, talking, communicating with the community about what was going on social media. But we did find that, some of those well-resourced councils did a really great job. Others, it was much more variable in terms of the quality of information that was available to people. In terms of information generally, so there was a lot of, a lot of the pre-flood conversations were really about communication and information warnings and the like. And so one of the issues that came up repeatedly again was around a need or desire to have more localized information. So what we were finding is people were saying, forecasts, for example, and the quote there on the bottom sort of picks out some of that information, is saying, the forecasts were there, but they didn't feel they were relevant or specific enough to be locally relevant to them. So they didn't know how to use it. They didn't find it useful. And that was driving, people to different places to get their information. And of course, one of the most obvious ones is, in the community. So we were finding that, people were looking more to social media, local social media, to get information. On the graph there on the right, we gave a statement about whether people were relying on would be relying more on information from the community in future. And you can see that a high proportion of people were saying that they would be relying more on that community information, and possibly less then, therefore, on some of the more official sources of information. We also found that in some areas, and in particular, rural areas, upper catchment areas, people were very switched on about floods and how water moved in the landscape. So they were aware that, what the gauges were saying, if they were, working and they were using that information. They knew a lot about, the things that were going on. They wanted to alert local communities, and some of those were able to do that through the connections they already had in place. Others struggled to get that information accepted. And so there were some frustrations in some of those areas as well. And this leads nicely also into information expectations. So what we found is that people not only wanted their information to be locally relevant to them, but they also wanted it to be, accurate and timely. And we all get used to using apps and real-time information, and so therefore it's quite a frustration to not have that information readily to hand. So there is an expectation that the information will be available sort of quickly. We also found that people were using a lot of social media for their information, and the graph there is saying what sorts of information were people getting from social media. So you can see that nearly 90% of people on the survey were saying that they were getting local community information from local community groups on social media during the floods. But 60% were also getting their official information from there as well. So a wide use of social media. And for me, I've looked at research in this area for a few years now, and it's clear to me that some of the community-based social media sites are becoming far more sophisticated, far more knowledgeable information sites where local information is curated, and that includes official sources of information that are added in and not tampered with and are available. And of course, they really sort of bring together all of that sort of requirement that people feel they have for that locally relevant information. The final slide here around the pre-flood situation is around preparedness. So one of the things that people spoke to us about in the interviews, when we asked them about things that they'd learned or things that they would advise other people to do, if they found themselves in similar situations, was to be more prepared. And of course, for people who've been flooded previously, that would be quite a reasonable expectation. For people who'd not been flooded previously and didn't think they were at risk, slightly trickier. But you can see here on the graph and on the screen there, around 30% or so of people felt that they'd done everything they could to prepare. And of course, some people had more time than others to prepare. So what we found was those who'd had prior flood experience and those who had more time available to them were more prepared. So perhaps not surprisingly, but that was a clear finding in the survey. When we asked people who weren't as prepared as they felt they could be, why they weren't prepared, you can see here that the time factor comes in as a major factor here. But there are also other things in here that I think are really interesting that we can use to sort of inform, further research and policy. People didn't know what to do, and people weren't able to get back to the property to actually do anything. There were issues for people around, not being physically able to, say, lift their possessions up high or bring them upstairs, those sorts of things. Clearly, those are problematic. Others that felt just too, stressed and unfocused and couldn't do that, or needed to look after other people or animals. So a range of different reasons why people were struggling to prepare. Other examples given were things like, not realizing that it was serious enough to have to deal with this. We had people that had made some preparations, but actually felt that they ended up being underprepared because they didn't think the flood was going to be as bad as it was. So, there was quite a lot of reassurance going on, or, false reassurance in some ways, saying, we don't think this will be as bad as last time. And so people would do what they had done previously, but it wasn't enough. So they found themselves sort of a bit caught out with that. We did also ask about the sorts of things people had done. So you can see on the bottom here, a lot of people, these were things that most people had done who had done some kind of preparation. So charging phones and devices, raising possessions, moving cars, stocking up on food and water when they had time and knew that things were going to happen. The moving cars was quite interesting because we had a few people tell us that they moved their cars, but they wish they'd actually put stuff in the cars before they moved them. So they moved empty cars and then needed to evacuate, in the car they had at home, but they didn't have the space that they were anticipating they would have because the empty car was parked safely somewhere else, but they couldn't get access to it or couldn't actually use that space. In terms of things that people hadn't done, not so much sort of sandbagging generally, and very few people had put sort of sandbags or anything over drains and in toilet bowls to sort of stop water coming up, and very relatively few had actually turned off their electricity or gas before leaving or as part of their preparations. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a good overview of some of that pre-event, those pre-event findings. In terms of what people did during the flood, I've got a couple of things here I'm going to talk about. The first is a bit about the early warning and how they first found out. And then the second is about what happened to people who stayed during the floods. So what we found is we asked people how they first found out that they were at risk and that there may be some flooding going on. And there was only one response people could give to this in terms of a single response. So you can see here that a lot of people found out about the flooding through their own observations. So they found out, in the lead up, or they were already engaged in floods and concerns about that. So they were aware of that. They're aware of water rising, rivers rising, etc. But if you take out that, you can see there's not a lot to call between what's left there. We found a lot of people did find out from friends and neighbours and family contacting them. And so, of course, if people were well connected, that was helpful. But the other in the bottom of that graph there, a lot of people in that sort of chunk there were saying they didn't know. They just didn't know. Nobody had spoken to them. Nobody contacted them. They were unaware that they were going to get flooding. You can also see here that people were getting their information through SMS messages, through the Bureau of Meteorology, and through other official sites as well. So those were part of the picture too. But you can see there's a reliance here on community connections and connections generally, but also some reliance on technology. And of course, that has some potential issues as well that we'll see later on. And here you can see, when we asked people about any problems they had accessing warnings during the event, you can see that already a quarter were in places where there was already poor mobile reception or black spots to start with. And then around half had lost their connections at some point during the flooding. And others didn't know where to go and look for information. Of course, that's got some important implications for people in various agencies. In terms of what people did during the event, we asked them, what did you do? You can see here on the left-hand side that 9% weren't home, so there was nothing they could do actually at home. 30% left and 61% stayed or sheltered at home during the floods. Of the 30% that left, just like in bushfires, we find that some of those people left late and in very dangerous and traumatic circumstances. And so, of course, for them, it was absolutely important that they left and evacuated, but of course, it didn't come without some sort of personal costs as well. In terms of those who stayed, we asked them what their reasons were for staying, and that's what you've got on the graph on the right-hand side there. So you can see there's a whole lot of different reasons that people gave for why they stayed. So I'm just going to break that down a little bit. So you can see that for some people, they weren't able to stay. So they weren't able to leave. So it wasn't a case that they chose to stay, they just didn't have a choice. So when they came to leave, they found that roads were blocked or the water had risen over the roads and they couldn't drive out, that sort of thing. And of course, we've got a range of different experiences here. So you'll appreciate that's why we've got a range of different answers here too. Further down, but halfway down, you can see 38% said they'd stayed because they'd stayed before. And of course, that worked for some people, but others got more caught out because of the severity of the flooding. And others said that they didn't reach their property. So 31% said it didn't get bad enough, they didn't feel they needed to leave. So they had a different experience. You've also got people here that always plan to stay. So, they definitely planned to stay and they stayed. And also in here, I think a few other things to pick out are things like, people staying for active reasons. So staying because they needed to protect their animals or livestock. People who stayed to reduce damages, so they were sort of like raising their things up, during the course of the flooding to prevent loss. Others stayed because they felt that they were likely to get looted, so staying to protect their property from looting was another thing, and concern about not being able to get back to protect their property was something there as well. And also there were other perhaps more worrying things in here. So there are people who had nowhere to go. There were people that had no transport. There were people at the bottom there who felt that they couldn't physically leave because it was too difficult. So a whole lot of different issues for those different groups in there. What we found with those who stayed was that 20% required some form of help to leave. So half of those people require some kind of emergency evacuation where they were helped by others to get out in fairly sort of acute sort of situations. And the other half were helped out afterwards, perhaps when the water wasn't receding and when things were safer. They were just helped out to sort of get out of their homes at that point. And we asked about the challenges that people had encountered while they were staying in their homes during the flooding. So we found that, as you can see here, a large proportion sort of lost electricity during that time, lost water, lost the sewerage and use of the toilets. So a whole heap of different sort of things here that were happening for people who stayed, including things like, being injured or ill. When we had people like COVID, for example, in there as well, and quite a bit of anxiety in there for people who were staying during that time as well. However, when we asked them whether staying was the right decision or not, you can see here that nearly 80% of people said that, yeah, even if it was bad, it was still the best decision. So I think that again is really interesting in terms of how we work with that information. So moving on now to that period after the flooding, I want to talk a little bit now about the cleanup, because that was really interesting from our research point of view in terms of some of the things that were coming up there, but also talk briefly, I think, about some of the housing issues and insurance issues. So the cleanup was an interesting part here. And I think the one thing I want to talk about initially is the fact that there was so much help that came during the cleanup. And most people we spoke to were very grateful for the help that they'd received. And as you can see here in the graph, when we asked who helped with the cleanup, we found that family, friends, neighbours, local people they knew from networks, were there helping, offering help. And that was gratefully received. There were other people that came out from out of area, the Mud Army groups that came in that helped. And again, the most part, a lot of that help was gratefully received as well. The fire services were praised a great deal here in help with, hosing out properties and cleaning up for people. That was a great thing as well. And of course, the military were in here too. And we had some lovely examples of neighbours, of helping neighbours in terms of, taking stuff out and actually repairing it or recovering it for people. So, the example there is the neighbour who took, boxes of old photographs and spent weeks and weeks drying them out. And we had a few of those. And again, these things were very moving for people when they talked about the help that they'd received. So that part was really positive. But the cleanup wasn't without challenges. So this graph here is a bit busy for you to look at, perhaps as part of this presentation, but we asked people about their satisfaction with various parts of the cleanup process. And you can see here from left to right, we've got extremely satisfied in the dark blue, going through to extremely dissatisfied on the right-hand side in the lighter blue. So you can see already that some of those areas, like in terms of how much satisfaction there were, people were very satisfied or more satisfied with the amount of help they received and the timing of that help. So again, that sort of just underscores what I've just said. But you can also see there are some issues here for people in terms of dissatisfaction with the advice they received about what to save and the time they had to make those decisions. And of course, this was something that came up quite a bit in our interviews because it was quite a bit down the track. They didn't have time to think about things that had been thrown away, to regret some of the decisions they made, to regret some of the things they allowed other people to do. And then to replace those items was becoming, problematic from a point of view of scarcity, of expense. So things were, more expensive. They weren't available. So we had examples of people, having, hardwood mouldings pulled out of their homes, quite distressed about then trying to sort of replace those and finding they couldn't source them or afford them. So there was some, frustrations in that part. And then lower down in this graph, you can see some comments around sort of council collections and clear up. So a lot of people were very grateful for the help that they got to get rid of those items. But also there were issues there around feeling sort of rushed because they didn't know if that help would come again, whether they would get either help from people helping with the cleanup or the opportunity to get rid of those things later on. So some sort of awareness around that would have been helpful for some of those people. Another couple of points just finally on the cleanup I wanted to mention. The first one there is a great example, I think, of the sort of the mindset that some people were in during that cleanup process. So in this particular instance, the lady who we spoke to here, she and her husband had been through a very traumatic sort of evacuation of their home. The husband didn't swim and he'd been very traumatized, I think, by this. And So a few times people talked about the help coming from outside and wanting to take advantage of that because of the urgency of the situation and wanting to move on and kind of get things cleaned up, etc. Completely understandable. But then finding in some cases they felt railroaded by that experience, partly because they just weren't coping themselves in terms of being able to answer questions, being able to sort of keep track of who was doing what. So this lady sort of said that her husband was basically struggling at this point. And so she sent him to the garage to work with people there and to sort of, try and protect some of the things and stop things getting thrown out. And she said he was in such a state that he was helping to load the truck. She said they knew they threw out everything and he was supposed to be saying, no, stop it. But he wasn't capable. And then later on, he'd say to me, where's such and such? They loaded it on the truck. Why did they load it on the truck? Because you weren't capable of stopping them. You were supposed to be directing them and you couldn't do it. His memory's gone of that. It's like childbirth. And I think this quote encompasses quite a few things. Clearly there's that trauma and the headspace that people are in. There's also some of that relationship stuff there. You can feel it in that quote. And again, some of the stresses that come out later on as a consequence. So again, I think there was quite a lot that we can learn about how to support people better in that clear up, especially those who come in externally and help with that sort of thing. We also had some examples of what you generally call, I suppose, bad behaviour. We have had quite a lot of people talking to us about looting and stealing that was going on repeatedly, post-flood, but also during the floods in some cases. And then there was a scavenging of things. So, people having their lives basically out on the street in front of them. And the comment was often made that, it's not a council clear up. This is my life that's there on the street. I haven't wanted to get rid of these things. I've had to do this. And there are people here that are rifling through stuff. They're helping themselves. They're making money out of this. And of course, that was quite distressing for people as well and quite tricky. A couple more areas just to talk about quickly here, post-flood. The first one really is about housing and talking about some of the issues around temporary housing. So I think if you start to think about what some people had gone through, housing itself, your home is your place of security. It's where you feel safe. It's where you have your ties with your community. So when you lose that suddenly, it's a massive impact on people. And we were hearing about this from different types of people in terms of, the impacts it was having on them. And this particular person is saying, sorry, that's my dog. These people are saying that the issue they had is they were in temporary accommodation in a holiday area where they were, kicked out of the accommodation at 10 o'clock and had nowhere to go until they could check into the next place. And during that period, they were very sort of feeling very sort of stressed and helpless in all of this. In terms of insurance, I'm going to briefly just pick through this, but this was just an example of some of the inflexibilities that we found in certain areas. So there were some issues around people needing to do things they didn't want to do. So they were waiting on decisions to take out gyprock, for example, for insurance purposes, seeing the damage that was increasing during that time. This person here is talking about issues around actually project managing some of that recovery and having to hold down a job, live somewhere off-site and all of that stuff. So there was lots of frustrations around not being able to be your property, to actually oversee some of that stuff, not being able to be part of your community and those links and access to that too. So in the final section here, I just want to very quickly talk about some of the reflections that people gave us around what had happened to them. And so 10 months down the track or so, people were sort of thinking a lot about what had happened and why it happened and why it had been worse than before. And one of the issues that came up frequently in this was around sort of the impact that buildings, infrastructure had on the floods. So we asked people about the extent to which they felt some of these things impacted their experiences in the flood. And you can see here on the right-hand side, I've taken out the not applicables. So this is only for people who felt these things were relevant to them. So you can see in particular here, things like stormwater drainage and maintenance and planning issues were things that people generally felt a bit frustrated around in terms of that. And part of that was because there were issues going on for people with flood assessments around the impact that stormwater versus floodwater had on their homes. So quite a lot of commentary around sort of the drainage and issues around maintenance of drainage, but other things like dredging channels, dredging rivers, levees and things that people had put up that on their properties that were impacting the way in which the water moved for them. And of course, things like the local dams. So a number of areas were impacted that had local dams that residents felt had not been managed properly or could have been managed better, and that actually just added to their experiences as well. And the final thing here, one of the final things here is around sort of sources of support. So we talked to people about how they felt they were going at this point, sort of often, this is in the survey, so this is around 10 months post-event. We asked them about how well they were recovering relative to other people, and we found that those people who'd been impacted by flooding, who had flooding this time round, and had less time to act before the flooding, generally reckoned they were doing less well. And those older people generally were feeling they were doing better. And people in that middle age bracket, often with families and jobs to hold down, were struggling a little bit more. And you can see on the right hand side there that sort of satisfaction with different types of support. And the one thing I think there is really important is the satisfaction with neighbours, family, community, and then other groups like Red Cross and Lifeline and those helping with recovery. A lot of appreciation for those different groups. And in the future, we asked people about what they were planning to do at this point in time. You can see on the graph there that many people were planning to stay where they were, and there were a whole lot of reasons for that. I mean, some people were locked in, didn't have the resources to sell. Others were waiting for decisions about buybacks, and we looked in the main report. You'll be able to see analysis of some of that, because we looked at who would be likely to stay, who would be likely to improve their homes to be more flood resilient and then stay, and those sorts of things. So we found some differences there as well. So just very quickly, some of the challenges I think that lie ahead are around some of those issues that I've already spoken about. So I'm not going to go into detail here. But the one thing that came out time and time again was the importance of community, the importance of connectedness. Community was the community, neighbours were the people who alerted people to the flooding. They were there to help them make decisions and do things during the floods. They were there in the cleanup. They were there supporting in the community afterwards. So anything that builds and supports community connectedness is massively important, I think, going forward for disasters, but more broadly, of course. Communication was a big part, of course, as well. Other things in here, I think that sort of increased flexibility, finding ways to do things slightly differently, not having to stick to the same rule-based approaches in some cases, for people to be able to get back into the homes and live there, perhaps with, less, with a couple of rooms, for example, was something that people wanted to do, but were being stopped for various reasons in some cases. That loss of agency and control, how hard that was for some people, thrown into this situation suddenly. Again, these things, not having a choice, feeling at the whim of other people's decision making is pretty tricky. In the report, we talk about sort of some of the broader challenge areas. And again, I won't go into the detail here, but things like erosions of trust in institutions and how to sort of maintain and retain some of that, balancing navigating that balance between community and emergency services and the disaster and emergency management sort of structures, the emotional impacts, of course, which are both extensive and long-term, and the fact that it's really important that we look at this beyond just the disaster, that if we can help people maintain these connections generally, if we can support them with what they need in peacetime, we'll be in a far better position when it does come to disasters. So a more person-centered approach. What we're doing with the information, we are looking a lot at trying to disseminate, and of course this is why we've got the webinar here. We've been attending a number of briefings, running some workshops with different organisations. The academics here have been talking at conferences and writing research papers. We're in the middle of a number of those, and also doing some more detailed analysis in some areas for different groups. NHRA, of course, is really important to them that their research is both useful, usable and used. So evaluation of that research and how it's being used is an really important part of what we're doing as well. So I'd like to say thank you for your time here on this webinar. If you've got any more inquiries, you can forward those to Nicola and Kat in NHRA. You can get the main report there. This is our team. I'd really like to say a big thank you to everybody involved that helped us with this. And now we're over to questions, I think.
Thank you very much, Mel. I know there is a huge amount of research to get over there in a fairly short amount of time. You did a very good job. So we'd now like to welcome to Fiona and Kim up here onto the panel, and we've got some time to answer a few of the questions. So I'm going to go with this one by Jean T. St. Clair. Did you receive much data in terms of the rescue experiences, particularly when rescued by spontaneous volunteers or civilian rescuers? So Mel, I'll over to you for this one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll also hand over to Kim at some point too, because they talk to the people in Queensland, but certainly in the Northern Rivers, we spoke to quite a number of people about the experiences as part of those interviews. And again, that's a bit of a harder thing to do, sort of to condense into sort of themes as such, because they were very individual experiences. But certainly we did hear, everything from sort of milder things, but through to the much more sort of serious and life-threatening situations. And how about you, Kim?
Yes, thanks, Mel. We did too. We heard from a lot of people who had interactions with the SES, with QFES, and with people that actually took it upon themselves to, hop in their boat and rescue people because they could do that. So there in the data, there's actually quite a few instances of that.
And a question here from John Bates. Hello, John. Mel, did the research cover the perennial challenge of people that buy in floodplains because they love the location, but then they want others to make sure that they don't get flooded? So I guess that's, the amenity and then transferring the risk over to others to make sure that you're safe. Did you come across participants who were talking about that?
Yeah, definitely. And indeed go on the field work. We visited some beautiful houses, and you could tell how lovely it would be to live there for all those other days of the year. But certainly, a whole lot of reasons why people were living on the floodplains to start with. From the perspective of either sort of the livability and the access to water, through to affordability and other things. I don't know if Fiona has anything else she wants to add there.
Also connecting with the question about differences between urban and rural areas. I think what became apparent in some of the interviews, particularly from the urban interviews in New South Wales, was that a number of people who were interviewed had not had prior experience with floods and were not very knowledgeable about the flood risk of the suburbs that they were living in. So these are particularly newer suburbs, new urban developments. So that was something that came out from those interviews. Yeah.
And just to add to that, John, some of the people we spoke to, particularly in Gympie, had been flooded before, and they knew they had a plan, and they knew that it was going to get to a certain level, but for whatever reason, this flood was different. So we found a lot of people who had expectations, and I think they were a little bit shocked when the flood didn't behave in the way that they thought it would. A number of people said, I knew it was when it was going to come to here, what I had to do. And even one chap had a series of pulley systems to lift all of his machinery and equipment up, but the flood behaved differently. So I think that's something that came out quite strongly, is that even though you have, previous experiences with floods, they're not always going to be the same because of those other influences from developments and things like that have changed the way the water behaves.
Yeah, and I think we can all distinctly remember those interviews we conducted where we were interviewing people who were really well informed, really well prepared, did everything they had, and yet the extreme nature of this event and combined with, changes in the catchment meant that, floodwaters didn't behave as they were, expected them to behave. Yeah.
So this is a question from DFES. Did your study look at the needs of children and young people before, during, and after the floods?
I mean, we didn't specifically have that as an aim, but of course it inevitably came up quite a lot in conversation, especially I think, the impacts on children of both the trauma of having experienced the floods in some cases, but also the disruption afterwards, to schooling, issues for older children who'd already been through COVID during, exams and other things, those setbacks, concerns about displacement out of their communities and the ties that they had, and people wanting to stay connected, but struggling to keep their kids connected. So we certainly had quite a lot of people talk about children. We haven't focused on that at this point in the report, but it's certainly an issue, and older people as well.
And there's a similar question about called communities. That's culturally and linguistically diverse people. I know that also wasn't a focus, but I know that you certainly captured data on that.
Yeah, I don't know if Fiona or Kim wants to mention anything there specifically. Obviously our interviews were conducted in English, so there was underrepresentation of some of those communities, certainly in the study. But we did speak to people, from different language backgrounds and different sort of cultural backgrounds. So I think we did capture some aspects, but clearly that's more of a specific, I think, project.
And I think that goes to the wider theme that the research has indicated about the importance of social connectedness. So obviously in newer communities with newer residents, that's a bit more of a challenge. So in terms of policy findings, investing in sort of programs and social infrastructure that supports social connectedness is really important.
And I guess that leads on nicely to a question from Craig, who says, given the importance of community connectedness, were there any insights into what collective actions communities can engage in before the event to mitigate impacts of flooding for the entire community? Over to you, Fiona, for this one.
Yeah, so building on that prior point I just made, I think in terms of community efforts, it's about really knowing one's community from the neighbourhood up and being able to identify those members of your community that might need extra assistance in these extreme events, whether it's heat waves or floods, and reaching out to them before events and not relying on others to do that. So I think that's one key finding.
Did you want to add to that, Kim?
Thanks. One of the things we found in the research that we did in Queensland was the really strong communication networks through things like social media. There were either existing or created networks, say, for example, using WhatsApp. The limitations of that, of course, was when the electricity or your phone charge runs out, then that actually created a number of problems. But there were a lot of very spontaneous or reinforced type networks that came together for that flood response. So finding ways to support those types of networks and finding alternative ways to enable those communication systems to continue post-event, I think is really important.
Yep. Mel, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I think that there's certainly sort of existing networks that were in place that came to the fore. So whether they were the sports groups or religious church groups, etc. Who came and helped out. So I think some of those pre-existing networks that were there for other reasons, whether they were sporting, equestrian, or otherwise, they were really useful. So again, it just underpins, I think, that importance of encouraging that connection within communities through whatever means required. It doesn't have to be emergency related, but I think that benefits come when, regardless.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it a close there because we are now 2 minutes past 1. We had lots of great questions. Thank you, everyone. So I just wanted to say the work is now being extended with fieldwork about to begin in Tasmania and also planning now underway for fieldwork in Victoria and South Australia. For the New South Wales and Queensland work, we're busy ensuring the research is communicated to all stakeholders who need to hear it. We're having targeted presentations and workshops, and the full report and summary version are available on our website. And what we really want is for this research to make a difference. And if we can do a better job of that, please let us know. So if you do have a spare 5 minutes, please complete the survey that Mel advertised on one of her slides, that QR code. But don't worry if you missed it, we will email a link through to you, and along with an email that you'll receive about the recording of this webinar, which will hopefully be available later this week. So we'll let you know about that. So I'd like to thank Mel for presenting today, for Kim and Fiona to assisting with these questions, and also to the full research team for all their hard work on this project. I'd also like to thank all the participants who took part in the research, the community groups and the local government, so everybody who supported this. I know that many of you are in the audience today, and I thank you for tuning in and for all your questions and all your support. So for updates on everything at Natural Hazards Research Australia, from webinars to new research projects, please sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. And I'd like to thank you all. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and see you next time. Thank you.